Think about it. Where would we all be without science? The field of science has given us just about everything. Medicine, technology, you name it. And as society continues to evolve, we'll all be relying on science even more going forward. But what about the contributions of African geniuses? For some reason, historians seem to always omit the contributions of Africans to sciences. Well, in this video, we're about to change that. Join us as we explore some of the amazing scientific work that has come out of the African continent, as well as their impacts on our society at large. One of the most significant contributions of science to our society has been the development of vaccines. Over the centuries, there have been several terrible diseases that have threatened our way of life. Smallpox, tuberculosis, heck, the world recently just went through a nasty bout with COVID-19. Imagine if we weren't able to develop a vaccine for that. We'd all still be stuck inside our homes having Zoom calls with our loved ones instead of being able to see them physically. Interestingly, these vaccines that helped us beat so many diseases have an African origin. According to reports, the person who first introduced inoculation, which is the theoretical root of vaccination, to the United States was an Akan from modern-day Ghana who had been enslaved in Boston. The story of the introduction of smallpox inoculation to colonial North America is fascinating on many fronts. In that story, which was initially found in the diary of a Boston minister named Cotton Mather, we see that the entire history of vaccination and our ability to beat diseases like the coronavirus wouldn't have been possible without Africans. According to historians, Mather was given an enslaved man by his Puritan church congregation in 1706. The enslaved man was essentially the property of Mather, and Mather felt free to rename him for a biblical slave named Onesimus. During a smallpox outbreak in Boston, Mather asked Onesimus if he had had smallpox before. Interestingly, Onesimus answered both yes and no. As Mather wrote in a letter to the Royal Society of London in July 1716, Onesimus told him that he had undergone an operation that had given him smallpox, and which would also prevent him from getting it again. Onesimus went on to share an old African inoculation method, even showing Mather a scar on his arm. At this time, smallpox had devastated the people of Boston, and seeing that there was a possible solution, Mather asked other enslaved Africans in Boston about the method that Onesimus had described, and he even sought the cooperation of Dr. William Douglas, the most revered physician in the region. But because of his prejudice, Douglas refused. However, a rural physician named Zabdiel Boylston was willing to take Mather up on this method. He went on to vaccinate almost 300 people between 1721 and 1722, including Mather's son. And of these people, they recorded only 6 deaths, which corresponds to 2%. During this time, Boston had about 7,500 cases of smallpox, with about 844 deaths. That is 11.25%. The method described by Onesimus was a resounding success, and subsequently, inoculation began to spread. Benjamin Franklin was one of those who motivated the use of this inoculation procedure in a pamphlet he authored in 1759. Even Thomas Jefferson, yes, the Thomas Jefferson, benefited from this process as well some years after. And in 1796, an English physician named Edward Jenner developed a much safer version of the process using cowpox. Subsequent iterations would end up leading to storable, more effective vaccines, such as the one used in treating COVID. But without Onesimus and the traditional African method, none of these would have been possible. If you're watching this, I'm pretty sure you hated math class as a kid. I mean, it's not your fault, but the teachers sometimes are not doing their best to feed the natural curiosity of the kids. Well, love it or hate it, you can't deny the facts. Math is and always has been an important subject. And as a society, we'd be lost without it. The general belief about math is that it began with the Sumerians and then spread all the way to the Greeks, who developed it with some input from the Indians and the Arabs. But what history conveniently leaves out is the fact that Africans were actually the pioneers of math, and they did more work than most other cultures to advance the subject. The oldest known mathematical artifact is the Lubombo bone, found in Swaziland and dated to 35,000 BC. Similarly, the Ishango bone was found in the Congo and dated to 20,000 BC. It is suggested that it could have been used as a tool for multiplication and division or to follow the menstrual cycle, amongst others. But among the oldest evidence of complex mathematics, we found the Moscow and Rhind papyri, written around 1900 BC, during the 13th and 12th dynasties in Egypt, respectively. They contain problems in arithmetic, geometry, and algebra. They also include decimal notation, systems of equations, volumes, and areas. In fact, it gives a very accurate estimate of the area of a circle. From the invention of our numbers systems to things like trigonometry, geometry, algebra, fractions, and so much more, Africans have pioneered math systems. Interestingly, the ancient Egyptians weren't the only Africans to pioneer math concepts that completely changed the world. Today, the numbers we use are known as Arabic numerals. The Arabs and Indians are credited with having popularized the numerals, while also adding the very important number 0. But manuscripts from 1740 BC, a full 1,000 years before the Arabs, show the Egyptians using the hieratic form of writing. It might have had a different numbering system, but the hieratic writing form was definitely the precursor to the writing system we have today. Just like that, the very foundation of our current math system would have been impossible without the contributions of the Egyptians. And, thanks to their input, we've been able to develop even more advanced concepts and systems over time. Over the years, there have been several significant debates about the origins of the classical civilization that we know and see today. Many believe that the Greeks began our civilization, with races like the Romans and Arabs also playing a part in developing it. However, archaeological findings have now shown that, in fact, civilization just might have started from ancient Egypt. For centuries, archaeologists have known about the impact of ancient African influences on some of the classical civilizations that we have. But as you can imagine, these influences rarely get spoken about in the history books. Of course, it should be pointed out that showing Africa's influence on civilization doesn't mean that other races were incapable of building out their societies. It's much farther from that. If anything, it fills in the gap that our current narrative of history has imposed. Over the years, there have been several pieces of evidence to show that Africans were once the dominant race. In fact, we can trace much of this to the very development of agriculture. Following the effects of the last ice age, the global ecological landscape shifted significantly. One of its most significant effects was the increase in fertility for the land surrounding the Fertile Crescent, a region in the modern-day Middle East that comprises countries like Egypt, Iraq, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. Fertile soil and an abundance of water from bodies like the Nile and Tigris led the Natufians to develop agriculture. And in 12,000 BC, the true first modern civilization appeared in what is now Syria. There is historical interconnectedness and interaction between Eastern Africa and the Middle East. They are both adjacent to each other, and they share water bodies such as the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. There has been discussion of the similarities between Natufian culture and those found in coastal North Africa, and it was shown that Natufians carried Northern and Eastern African ancestry in their DNA. With the discovery of agriculture, humans were now able to take on more developmental projects that were impossible in the previous hunter-gatherer society. The Natufians, who were the dominant race at the time, helped expand the practice of agriculture across the region. They also settled in permanent or semi-permanent settlements, marking another distinction from the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Besides agriculture, we should also point out the impact of Africans on civilization itself. It's a common belief that the Greeks were the ones who gave us modern civilization, from poetry to politics to even the Olympic Games. But Greek history becomes even more interesting when you consider what the Greeks themselves said about the origin of their civilization and knowledge. Besides learning everything they knew from the Egyptians, the Greeks have also credited much of their discoveries to them. Indeed, ancient Egypt influenced Greek art, religion, philosophy, mythology, and society in general. For the ancient Greeks, it was common knowledge that Egypt was the fount of all wisdom. Herodotus visited Egypt around 500 BC and mentioned the high degree of specialization of Egyptian doctors. Probably Plato, Thales, and Pythagoras also set foot in the land of the Nile. Pythagoras remained in Egypt for more than 20 years, learning math but also visiting the temples, and he won the esteem and admiration of all the priests and prophets with whom he associated. Many archaeologists believe that the Greeks themselves were inspired by the Egyptians in their efforts to build a society. Aside from the Greeks, the Romans were also said to have traced their origins to Africa. The Etruscans, a society that inhabited Italy before the Romans, were said to have been the precursors of the Romans, giving them pretty much everything from their art to their engineering prowess and much more. While technologically advanced, however, the Etruscans weren't violent people. When the Romans came along, they wiped out the Etruscans and settled on their land. Well, according to German archaeologist Gerd Müller, the Etruscan civilization was created by ancient Egypt. They were an offshoot of ancient Egypt that settled in modern-day Italy, only to be wiped out by the Romans following an invasion. Other experts claim that their DNA is related to Neolithic groups in Central Europe that were later intermarried with African travelers and tradesmen. Described as dark-skinned people, the Etruscans worshipped the Egyptian sun god Ra and even had Egyptian-like tombs. When the Romans came, they took over everything the Etruscans had built, becoming a dominant race almost overnight. All of these show that Africa has a legitimate claim to being the first fully developed civilization in the world. And with their help, both society and agriculture, two building blocks of the modern human race, were propagated. History can be a fickle thing. And as we've all seen several times, there are periods when records and reports don't necessarily reflect what really happened over time. While science and technology have evolved, it is important to tell accurate stories. And as we've seen, the contributions of the African continent to the development of these concepts have been greatly underrepresented. It's just a matter of time before the truth comes out, and we'll all see what it truly is.